Have you ever thought how many billions of wheels are turning day and night on our Earth? One could say that they imitate the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Indeed, if we watch the planets in outer space or some smaller unities of life here on Earth, it is then possible to realize why the wheel took circular shape and not a triangular or rectangular form. According to present-day information, between 4,000 and 3,500 years BC, the Sumerians must have made their first carts in the woods of the Euphrates River, where Iraq now stands today. Before the Sumerians, people were living isolated in individual groups, and they were producing only for their individual needs. Here, they began to live in walled cities, to develop the agriculture, and to mark their experiences in monuments. It is said that the oldest road was the Persian Royal Road, which was in use from 3,500 until 300 BC. It had a length of 2,850 kilometers, starting from Susa and ending at Ephesus on the Aegean coast. As the historian Herodotus writes, one needed 3 months to cover that distance, which means 30 kilometers per day. Later, the wheel was utilized by the Assyrians, who constructed efficient chariots for war. Yet they were not using it in their everyday life. Instead, they had the cheap labor of slaves who were dying before reaching their 30s, whereas the wheel was immobile under the body of a king. In ancient Egypt, we find that the wheel came rather late, around 1600 BC. But even so, the slaves were moving colossal statues and stones on sledges, as the wheel was the exclusive privilege of the kings. In Minoan Crete, there were stone roads with a double rut for the wheels of the carts, which were pushed by men and not dragged by animals. As we all know today, the next step in the development of civilization came about in Athens, in ancient Greece, around 500 BC. For moving the marble stones from the mountains into the towns, there were various opinions. Some believed the Greeks were using a type of sledge, drawn by ropes from one end and levered by poles from the other. Others, such as Plutarch, believed that the large marble pieces were carried by special carts, drawn by as many as 24 oxen. To lift them, they were using pulleys and cranes. The historian Vitruvius mentions that the Cretan architects of the Ephesus temple, Chersiphron and Metagenes, carried the marble pieces with 2 wheels. Nevertheless, the contribution of the ancient Greeks to road building was not very important. Their mountainous terrain and the existing social relationships and methods of production forced them to develop maritime routes instead. On the land, they repeated the Cretan rut, as we can still see from the ruins at Corinth, which they were using to move their ships by land. It was the Romans who raised road building to scientific levels. They understood quite early that this was the most efficient way of controlling their immense empire. For 500 years, from 300 BC to 200 AD, they built and maintained 85,000 kilometers of excellent roads, which were 4 to 7 meters wide. And they connected for the first time in history Scotland with Persia and Gibraltar with the Black Sea. They were building roads whenever they were not at war, putting the occupied people to work at forced labor. Their postal chariots were covering 60 kilometers per day, and they had stations for changing horses every 20 kilometers. The Emperor Tiberius covered 330 kilometers in one day, going to Lyon to reach his dying brother. In his marathon effort, he ruined 3 chariots. In those days, the Celtic coachmakers brought the novelty of the swiveling front axle along with primitive wooden ball bearings. In the same period, the water wheel, invented by the Greeks, was in frequent use. Then history decided that the Romans had outlived their usefulness and sent them destruction in the form of Huns, Goths, Vandals, and Germans. Thus, with science buried under the ruins of Greece and Rome, the Dark Ages started. They were to last 1,200 years. The Holy Roman Empire was split in small kingdoms, whose rulers didn't pay for any maintenance of roads. With the wars and their attendant destruction, the roads diminished, the commerce shrank, and many towns disappeared. So the wheel almost disappeared, and people returned to the horse. The poor were traveling on foot. The rich traveled either on horseback or were pushed on a barrow, or carried by 2 or more bearers in a sedan chair. They were seldom traveling by cart, as these were uncomfortable and caused much bruising. The dominant social system throughout Europe in the Middle Ages was feudalism. In each kingdom, 95% of the people were serfs and were not permitted to leave the place of their ruler on penalty of death. There was little need of transport. Consequently, carts were few and only for the noble. But around the 12th century, trade once more started to develop. The old towns were rebuilt, and the wheel started turning again in all shapes of carts. As a result, people started repairing the roads. In the 13th century, and for the first time since Julius Caesar, a code of traffic appeared in some German towns, which gave priority to the rider over the pedestrian and the coach over the rider. Despite all this, the roads in Europe remained unsurfaced until the Industrial Revolution. The winter rain was making them impassable and stopping the commerce. In 1571, in Marburg, Germany, 3 coaches fell into a huge hole full of mud, and many people perished. The roads of Paris were a labyrinth of muddy tracks where people and pigs converged. In remote China, they had used the wheel for pottery and spinning since time immemorial. The wheels of their carts were huge with many spokes, sometimes as many as 40. In South America, the Incas had a highly developed network of roads, some of which are still in use in Peru today. The more primitive Aztecs of Mexico and the Indians of North America never learnt the use of the wheel. In the meantime, in Europe, the wheel was entering the everyday life of the people, easing them in their manual labor. The toothed wheel, which was going to revolutionize the life of the 19th and 20th century, was appearing in cranes and clocks. One of the most famous clockmakers was the Englishman John Harrison, who lived in the 18th century. He spent all his life in order to give the sailors the indispensable clock for the exact measuring of longitude, thus stopping many wreckages and loss of life. An important improvement in agriculture came around 1400, when French farmers made the cart tilt on the axle beam, as we can still see today. Man did not forget to use the wheel as a means of torture. The ancient Greeks were tying their victims to the wheel, and by turning it, they were stretching his muscles, thus provoking intolerable pain, without causing death. The Europeans of the Middle Ages, and more specifically the Inquisitors, were even more ingenious, by adding a wreath of thorns, whipping, beating, burning, and ending by cutting off the head. The charm of the wheel to man found artistic expression in the architecture of the Gothic church. The aristocratic character of the period, which succeeded the Middle Ages, made every technical progress accessible only to the noble. so the wheel was rolling more comfortably and securely, particularly when it was on the axle of a royal coach. Colonial conquest by the people of Western Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries brought considerable riches into the metropolis. So the towns grew, and so did the roads. In the construction of roads, the French were excellent. In 1776, they had a network of 41,000 kilometers. They were covering their roads with small stones, a method that attracted the attention of German road builders. By contrast, the English roads were very bad in that period. However, from the end of the 17th century, English coachmakers started improving the coaches by developing the first spring suspension, and thus making travel more tolerable. Thus, from 1660, there were regular services by coach, which stopped every 15 kilometers at wayside inns to change horses and take passengers. At that time, the 100 kilometers from London to Oxford took one day. It's worth noting that the coaches never travelled by night because of the fear of highwaymen. The French Revolution of 1789 marked the end of the feudal way of life. The merchants came to the fore, and the landowners were forced to withdraw. The big towns obtained better roads and parks, and public buildings became a thing of beauty. The end of the 18th century and a great part of the 19th saw the golden age of the coach. They increased in number as commerce and competition made them accessible to greater stratas of population. But the fate of mankind had predicted that the wheel was going to marry with steam in order to change the face of the planet. Only the betrothal lasted many centuries. The theory was developed in the 6th century by Greek philosophers who believed in the existence of 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. "600 years later, the Alexandrian hero made his sphere of Aeolus, which was revolved by jets of steam. Then things remained stagnant for 1500 years. Leonardo da Vinci was not only the greatest painter of the Renaissance, he was also a mechanical genius. In his automatic spit, he achieved the movement of the wheel by steam propulsion. The French physician Denis Papin invented, amongst other things, the pressure cooker, called the bone digester, in 1680. But his basic contribution was the creation of the pump engine, with 1 cylinder and piston for lifting water. In 1714, the English ironmonger Thomas Newcomen applied Papin's invention into the mines of Devon to drain the water. Steam entered the cylinder from below, and when it was full, a valve was shut. A jet of cold water was introduced into the cylinder in order to condense the steam. As a result, the piston was forced down by atmospheric pressure. As the piston rod drew down one end of the beam, the other end rose, carrying with it the pump rod, which sucked water. The beam made 12 strokes a minute, each time lifting 10 gallons of water 50 meters high. After several decades, it was observed that Newcomen's engine was inefficient and was burning too much coal. In 1770, the Scottish scientific instrument maker James Watt invented a separate condenser that allowed a 75% saving of fuel. Sometime later, he also invented the sun and planet gear system, which modified the movement of Newcomen's beam engine into a circle that could drive a wheel and thus drive many different devices. The demand was enormous, and the results revolutionary for the fate of mankind. The face of England changed radically. From an agricultural country, it became the first industrial society of the world, with thousands of farm workers forced by poverty to find refuge in industry. the slipway of the ancient Greeks, the Germans used the wheel on the tracks of their mines from the 16th century. England followed suit shortly afterwards. With the development of the lifting machinery, the coal industry grew and made necessary the need to find quicker and more efficient methods of transport than the horse. In 1804, the British engineer Richard Trevithick constructed a steam engine that ran at 13 kilometers an hour and carried 10 tons of iron and 70 people. In 1808, he exhibited in London the first passenger train in the world. But his genius was neglected and he died a poor man, his friends having to pay for his funeral. The discoveries of Trevithick were to be advanced by the dynamic George Stephenson from the north of England, who started as a 9-year-old horse driver in the mines. In 1814, he completed a steam engine that could carry 8 wagons with 30 tons of load. Immediately after, he bet he would make a steam engine to pull 60 tons. Knowing that the steam engine had been proved 70% cheaper than the horse, he persuaded Parliament to let him give a public exhibition. In 1825, his steam engine locomotion, pulling 33 coaches and 600 people, ran 19 kilometers in 3 hours and reached the coast of Stockton, with the cheering of 40,000 people, saluting of guns and ringing of bells. But the shareholders of canals brought him before Parliament to account for his actions. First they accused him of being a foreigner because of his northern accent, and then stated that women would become barren, cows wouldn't give milk, and chickens would stop laying. Some even said that his engine was the work of the devil. Finally, his stubbornness won, because it was reflecting the mechanical needs of his era. In 1836, 700 kilometers of railroad were connecting the main industrial centers of Britain. Immediately afterwards, the train started transforming the rest of Europe. At the end of the 19th century, the new steam engines were able to pull 13,000 tons of load, whereas the horse-drawn wagons never exceeded 4. Their speed in comparison to the horse-drawn wagons became 15 times faster. From the 1870s, the growing population of the big cities created the necessity for the underground railway. As the the future, the American George Foer proposes a jet train which will move in a steel tube at a speed of 400 to 650 kilometers per hour, supported on a cushion of air and no longer needing a wheel. Nowadays, every year, there are 65 billion passengers in the world who are traveling by train and 110 billion tons of freight. Electric trains are the only mode of transport which do not add to environmental pollution. But unfortunately, many governments consider them not economical. Before the coming of the wheel, the only known noises of the sea made by men were the sails, the oars, the cracking of the whip on the bodies of the slaves, and gunshots fired by one group of people to destroy another. In 1707, Denis Papin constructed a steam-powered paddle ship on the river Fulda of Germany. The local bargemen prohibited the floating of this ship full of foreigners because they feared the competition. The scientists quarreled with them, and they took it on land and smashed it with their axes. In 1786, the American John Fitch placed steam-powered oars into a barge, but as it didn't go fast, people mocked him and provoked him into committing suicide. In 1790, the Scot Symington placed one steam-powered paddle into a boat which pulled a barge loaded with 70 tons. However, the authorities prohibited its use and called him ridiculous when he predicted that paddle ships would one day cross the Atlantic. In 1803 in Paris, the American engineer Fulton showed his paddle ship to Napoleon, who, under the influence of his academics, could only say, "Do you seriously want to move a ship by cigar smoke?" Nevertheless, Fulton didn't give up. In 1807, he constructed the 180-ton Clermont, which had two big paddles and a funnel 10 meters high. He sailed it from New York to Albany. In 1819, the American ship Savannah took 29.5 days to cross the Atlantic, in which time it used its paddles only for 3.5 days. In 1838, the English paddle steamer Great Britain of 1,340 tons crossed the Atlantic in 15 days. From 1837 to 1846, it made 64 such crossings. These achievements encouraged the shipbuilders, and the sea saw the number of paddle steamers growing. Unfortunately, paddle steamers burnt too much coal, and it was impossible to repair them if a breakdown occurred at sea. So for this reason, they always had to carry sails. In 1834, an English farmer named Smith attracted the attention of the Admiralty and built a ship which had as a propeller the screw of Archimedes. During the tests, by chance, a bottle got entangled and broke 2/3 of the propeller. Smith trying to return on the remainder, saw to his surprise that his speed had doubled. This instant proved that the propeller with one turn was the most efficient. Another proof came in 1843, when the British naval authorities ordered a competition between the ship Rattler with a propeller facing west and the ship Elector with two paddles facing east. The result was that the Rattler tugged the Elector backwards at 2.5 knots. In the same year, the naval engineer Brunel built the Great Britain for the Atlantic line. It had 3,300 tons of steel and was 105 meters in length. By 1857, Brunel had his Great Eastern ready, an iron giant of 30,000 tons with a propeller of 8 meters diameter and huge paddles having a diameter of 18 meters. From then onwards, men started building exclusively iron ships, and the new propellers had replaced the paddles by the end of the 19th century. The German Baron Freiherr Drais introduced the first bicycle in 1813, and the Scot Macmillan invented the pedal in 1839. But man could not rely exclusively upon his muscles for transport. He needed mechanical power. Nicolas Quignon, a French artillery officer, constructed this marvelous high-pressure steam-powered coach with 3 wheels in 1769. Unfortunately, the French state was in financial difficulties, so the engine and its inventor were totally forgotten. The first experiments in the 19th century for steam-powered vehicles produced strange, cumbersome, and rather noisy constructions. In addition, the opinion of the English public found the speed of 30 kilometers per hour diabolically fast and persuaded Parliament to reduce it to 10, thus making them slower than horse-drawn coaches and consequently uneconomical to run. One of the first who tried the internal combustion engine was the German Daimler in 1888. The American farmer, Henry Ford, had a mania for machines since he was a little boy. In 1896, he started serious experiments which resulted in the famous Model T that was produced continuously for 18 years. This model yielded 18 million cars. Each one cost $850 in 1908, yet only $290 in 1924. Creating the first mass production line in history, Henry Ford made the car accessible for the ordinary people. at the same period, one could not see so many private cars in England. As their prices were so high, they were only for the very rich, generally speaking. The mass production of cars in Europe started after the Second World War. The Americans, with their continuously advancing technology, went on and were able to construct remarkable highways and fantastic suspension bridges, thus adding greater beauty to the driver in his travels. Europe, subdivided in many nations, has not been able to match their achievements. But the overproduction of cars and their fumes has added a great amount to the existing industrial pollution and the health hazards in the cities. At the same time, the projects for the electrical car are growing, and with them, the hopes of the people for the correct alternative solution. Man must have envied the birds since he stood on his feet and could observe them better. However, no matter how much he tried to analyze their wings, he could not imitate them. Here again he needed wheels to take off and land. The American Wright brothers achieved the first flight in December 1903. It lasted only 59 seconds. Since then, the history of the aeroplane is well known. But the thirst of man for knowledge has pushed him outside his earthly home, and there he goes, with his wheels of imagination and science, moving into space. So man is now orbiting to make other space acquaintances. And he's asking, will the universe ever end? Does anything exist until it is observed? What are the basic building blocks of matter? In the last 2 decades, man knows a tremendous progress in the field of calculating machines. Now he is no longer relying on the wheel, as did Pascal with his first calculating machine in 1642. He has the transistor and other electronic devices, which mark in a way the beginning of the end to the reign of the wheel. And recently, man has managed to construct integrated circuits comprising 120 elements, which can pass through the eye of a needle. Yet, despite all this, even today, many primitive wheels are rolling on our planet, as exactly as they did during the Sumerian era, keeping more than 1/3 of the Earth's population in conditions of appalling poverty and starvation. Will the wheel of chance ever turn for them?